Number 10. Janelle Garrick. While working as a sheriff's deputy in Jefferson County, Wisconsin in 2018, Janelle Garrick was busted for burglarizing the homes of grieving families while they were at their loved ones' funerals. According to authorities, she scoured local obituaries, researched each descendant's relatives, and found out where they lived. She then robbed their homes while they were saying their final goodbyes to their deceased relative. Garrick's crimes were creative and carefully planned, but they weren't foolproof. At least one of the home break-ins was captured on surveillance footage, and the crooked deputy eventually landed at the center of an investigation. She lost her job and was arrested and released on bond, but it apparently wasn't enough to deter her from continuing to burglarize people's homes. While her initial case was still pending, Garrick was caught stealing narcotic painkillers from a home outside Milwaukee. Detectives ultimately connected her to at least 6 robberies through fingerprints left behind on evidence at the scenes. The prosecutor asked the judge for a 1-year prison sentence, but in a rare move, he imposed a harsher 2-year sentence followed by 3 years of probation. Garrick blamed her actions on her opioid addiction and agreed that she deserved punishment, but said that she felt she needed more help than was being offered. Number 9. Craig Payee. A few days after Christmas in 1986, 20-year-old college student Cara Knott left her boyfriend's house in Escondido, California, and headed to her parents' home in El Cajon. She never arrived at her destination. Her car was found on a dead-end street near Interstate 15 in San Diego County the next day, and her lifeless body was discovered at the bottom of a 65-foot, 19.8 meters ravine nearby. She had been beaten, strangled, and thrown off an abandoned bridge. 2 days after Cara's murder, a reporter interviewed 13-year California Highway Patrol veteran Craig Payee about how to avoid falling victim to predators on the road. He had suspicious scratches on his face, which he claimed were from falling against a sharp fence. But when the segment aired, at least 24 women reported that Payee had made inappropriate advances toward them in the past. Several callers claimed that Payee had pulled them over on the same exit ramp where Cara was killed. The women said that Payee wasn't violent toward them, but that he made unwelcome advances that made them feel uncomfortable. One witness told police that on the night of the murder, they saw Payee roll into a gas station near the crime scene at a high rate of speed and in an obviously disheveled state. Others reported seeing Cara's car getting pulled over by a CHP vehicle on the night of her death. Inside Payee's patrol car, investigators found forensic evidence connecting him to the murder scene. He was also linked to the crime through fibers found underneath Cara's fingernails. And while DNA technology was in its infancy, blood from the scene matched Payee's blood type, which also happens to be the rarest blood type. Even his colleagues were willing to testify in court regarding his strange behavior on the night of Cara's murder, and a closer look into his past revealed that he had a suspicious tendency to pull over women who were driving alone at night. Payee was charged with murder. His first trial ended in a hung jury, but the second trial ended with a conviction and a sentence of 25 years to life. He continues to maintain his innocence, but has refused to provide DNA in his efforts to clear his name, and has been denied parole 3 times. He'll be 77 years old when his next parole hearing rolls around in 2027. Number 8. Manuel Manny Pardo Jr. Manuel Manny Pardo Jr.'s law enforcement career began with the Florida Highway Patrol during the 1970s. By all outward appearances, he was a stand-up cop. He graduated from the police academy at the top of his class and saved a toddler's life during his first years on the job. But all was not as it seemed, and in 1979, Pardo was fired for falsifying traffic tickets. He soon found work as a police officer for the small city of Sweetwater in Miami-Dade County, where he stayed until 1985. Pardo lost his job after lying on the stand about being an international undercover agent in a criminal case. Shortly after being fired, the unemployed former cop got involved in drug smuggling. In early 1986, he fatally shot 2 men named Mario Amador and Roberto Alonso during a botched robbery. Less than a month later, one of his associates lured a man named Michael Millett to his wife's car. Paro had previously bought gun silencers from Millett, but suspected that he was a police informant. When Millett got into the car, Paro shot him in the head. The disgraced ex-police officer only continued to kill from there. In February 1986, just weeks after shooting Millett, he murdered Luis Robledo and Ulpiano Lido during a home invasion gone wrong. 2 months later, he killed 4 people in 2 separate incidents, one over a stolen property disagreement, and another stemming from a victim's failure to show up at multiple planned drug deals. During Paro's final double murder, he accidentally shot himself in the foot. Authorities apprehended him at a hospital in New York the following month. A search of his apartment turned up a disturbing trove of Nazi memorabilia. Paro admitted to at least 6 out of the 9 murders he was accused of committing, but tried to make his actions seem noble by claiming that he killed with the goal of combating Florida's drug culture. During his trial, he said that he took pictures of his victims after the murders to capture their souls and then burned the pictures in a special ashtray. He claimed he was sane despite his attorney's attempt to plead insanity on his behalf. According to prosecutors, Paro was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer and a drug dealer who killed as a way to eliminate his competition on the streets. He was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Paro was executed in 2012 by lethal injection at the age of 56. Number 7. Wasek Brock. While driving on the streets of Manhattan with his wife in 2013, Alexei and Leanne accidentally ran over a man on a motorcycle with his SUV. Around a dozen bikers immediately gave chase, making him too scared to stop at the scene. The gang surrounded Leanne on a highway exit and smashed up his vehicle, then pulled him out of the SUV and brutally beat him down. It would later come to light that one of the bikers was 34-year-old Wasek Brock, an undercover NYPD detective. While Brock didn't participate in the assault against Leanne, he did help chase the motorist down, and he smashed the SUV's rear window before fleeing the scene. And he failed to dial 911 or summon any sort of help from law enforcement. Brock and the other bikers claimed that they were just trying to stop Leanne from fleeing the scene of an accident. The disgraced detective insisted that he never meant to hurt anyone and that he fled as soon as he saw the other bikers attacking the victim. In other words, it was apparently his way of showing that he disapproved, or at least wasn't involved in the attack. Footage of the encounter and other evidence showed that the gang went far beyond reasonable means of stopping someone from fleeing an accident scene, and several of the individuals involved were criminally charged in connection with the incident. The judge overseeing Brock's case described the violence as an act of revenge, pure and simple. He found Brock guilty of assault, riot, and several other charges at the end of a 3-week bench trial, which means that there was no jury and that the decision to convict was entirely up to the judge. Needless to say, Brock was also stripped of his badge. The prosecutor urged the judge to sentence Brock to 3.5 years in prison, although he could have faced a sentence of up to 7 years. Meanwhile, the defense implored the judge to let the defendant off with no prison time. He received a 2-year sentence and was admonished in court for his apparent lack of remorse and his blatant lack of professionalism. Number 6. Sidney Dorsy. Sidney Dorsy became DeKalb County, Georgia's first African-American sheriff in 1996 at the age of 56. 4 years later, in 2000, he lost his re-election bid to 46-year-old veteran officer Derwin Brown, who vowed to investigate allegations of corruption against Dorsy. Just weeks later, and 3 days before he was slated to begin his term as sheriff, Brown was shot dead outside his home. Suspicion immediately fell on Dorsy, who had allegedly told several acquaintances that Brown would never take office and that there would be a special election for sheriff soon. Investigators traced the shooting to Patrick Cuffey, a former employee of Dorsy's private security firm who took a job at the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department's Internal Affairs Division during Dorsy's tenure. Dorsy had recruited Cuffey to kill Brown, but Cuffey didn't want to carry out the hit alone, so Dorsy encouraged him to seek help from 3 other former employees of his security firm. Melvin Walker, David Ramsey, and Paul Skyers agreed to help Cuffey commit the murder in exchange for promotions and jobs that they wanted. Coffey and Skyers testified against Dorsy in exchange for immunity, and Walker and Ramsey were acquitted of murder. Dorsy maintained his innocence, but was convicted of murder for masterminding the crime. He was sentenced to life for the murder charge and an additional 23 years for corruption charges stemming from his activities during his time as sheriff, which included using county funding and employees for personal expenses and errands. Dorsy reportedly admitted to ordering the hit in 2007, but claimed that he had second thoughts and tried to stop it from happening. Do you think Dorsy is less guilty than the men who carried out the hit, since he didn't actually pull the trigger? Or do you think he's just as guilty, or perhaps even more so, especially since the other defendants may not have committed the murder without his urging? Let us know in the comments below. Number 5. Drew Peterson. By the time Drew Peterson married his third wife, Kathleen Savio, in 1992, he had been working as a cop for the Bolingbrook, Illinois Police Department for 15 years. About a decade later, it became clear that he was heading toward his third divorce. Between 2002 and 2004, police were called to Peterson's home at least 18 times over domestic disputes. Not long after that, Kathleen was found dead in a dry bathtub with suspicious injuries. The case went before a coroner's jury, which included a personal friend of Peterson's who assured the other jurors that Peterson would never harm Kathleen. They ruled her death accidental, despite any evidence pointing to the contrary. Just 6 months later, 49-year-old Peterson married his fourth wife, 19-year-old Stacey Ann Cales. In 2007, 3 years into the marriage, Stacey's sister reported her missing. Peterson claimed that Stacey had left him for another man. Her body was never found, and she's still considered missing, but the case prompted authorities to exhume Kathleen's body and take a second look at her injuries. They reclassified her death as a homicide and charged Peterson with murder. While the autopsy results were never released to the public, prosecutors accused Peterson of attempting to stage Kathleen's death as an accident. He was convicted of the crime and received a 38-year sentence, but continues to maintain his innocence. In the meantime, the search for Stacey's remains continues. Drew Peterson is notorious for his cocky demeanor, which some might even describe as outwardly narcissistic. Number 4. Robert Carroll. During his career as an undercover police officer in Manchester, England, Robert Carroll took on an alternative identity as a drug dealer named Lee Taylor as part of an operation called Bluebeard. Its purpose was to crack down on real drug dealers, but he went to extreme lengths to make his false identity believable and got addicted to heroin. He would later claim that he got his first taste of the drug while carrying pockets of it in his mouth. Known as kitting, this got him accustomed to small amounts of heroin. Carroll also later alleged that he was exposed to the drug in other situations that his superiors were aware of. He left his undercover position in 2009 and went back to regular cop duties, but by then he was already addicted. 3 years later, in 2012, Carroll sought professional help for a problem that he realized he couldn't conquer on his own. But the addiction continued to control him, and he eventually got so hooked that he traded some of his police gear for heroin. Carroll got caught and was fired in 2013, and he was sentenced to 14 months in prison for theft and misconduct in public office. His actions may seem more desperate or like the unfortunate product of circumstance rather than deliberately criminal. And that's exactly what Carroll claimed in court when he sued the Greater Manchester Police in 2017. The disgraced ex-cop's former employer argued that he waited too long to file his claim, and they weren't wrong. He had exceeded the typical 3-year threshold for lodging a complaint in these types of cases. The police department also described Carroll's case as weak. But a panel of judges ultimately ruled that he had a right to at least have the evidence heard. In other words, they determined that Carroll could at least try to sue the department. And while it certainly wasn't a guaranteed win, it marked an unusual turning point in a situation where he normally would have been powerless. The outcome of the case is unclear. Number 3. Mikhali Popkov. Starting in 1992, Russian cop Mikhali Popkov murdered dozens of women in the city of Angarsk and elsewhere throughout the Irkutsk region. He targeted full-figured victims who resembled his abusive mother and gained their trust using his uniform and patrol car when he was actually off duty. Popkov offered rides to his victims, but instead of driving them to their destinations, he went to remote locations and viciously attacked them with various weapons, including knives, axes, baseball bats, and screwdrivers. His victims were often mutilated beyond recognition, earning the unidentified killer the nicknames of the Werewolf and the Angarsk Maniac. Authorities began investigating Popkov's crimes early on, but he managed to evade detection for the better part of 2 decades. Detectives eventually realized that the murders were probably being committed by a cop when they began discovering tire tracks at the crime scenes that matched a specific type of off-road vehicle used by law enforcement. They zeroed in on Popkov in 2012 after testing the DNA of 3,500 of the region's current and former police officers. During questioning, Popkov claimed he wanted to cleanse the streets of prostitutes. He also indicated that he believed his wife was unfaithful and that he was taking his rage over the suspected infidelity out on his victims. Popkov was convicted of 22 murders, although it's widely believed that he may have been responsible for more, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Number 2. Stephanie Lazarus. Sherry Rasmussen and John Rutan were only married for a few months before an unexpected tragedy brought their newlywed bliss to an abrupt end one afternoon in 1984. In what detectives initially classified as a burglary gone wrong, Sherry was found dead in the couple's home. Someone had beaten her and shot her 3 times in the chest at point-blank range. Unconvinced that his daughter was the victim of a botched robbery, Sherry's father, Nels, pushed detectives to investigate other possibilities. He claimed that his son-in-law's ex-girlfriend, a highly respected LAPD investigator named Stephanie Lazarus, had been harassing Sherry in the months leading up to her death. Investigators initially turned a blind eye to the lead, and the case went cold. As he fought an uphill battle to obtain justice for his daughter, Nels attempted to get some of the evidence DNA tested, and it conveniently turned up missing. The missing evidence was found in 2001, but Lazarus continued to fly under the radar until 2009, when a keen-eyed detective thoroughly reviewed the case file. DNA evidence tied Lazarus to the crime scene, and what started out as a normal workday for the art theft detective ended with her in custody as the prime suspect in Sherry's murder. During the trial, it was revealed that Lazarus and John Rutan had a casual relationship until John met Sherry. When Lazarus found out that her former lover planned to marry his new girlfriend, she evidently lost her mind and began wreaking havoc on the couple's lives. Prosecutors accused Lazarus of being enraged that she was nothing more than a fling to Rutan and that he saw Sherry as worthy of marrying. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life. Number 1. Annet Frank. Murder is not unusual in New Orleans, which carries one of the highest homicide rates in the United States. But one particularly brutal slaying rocked the city in 1995 when 23-year-old rookie officer Annet Frank and an accomplice, drug dealer Rogers Lacaze, opened fire on staff at a Vietnamese restaurant during the early morning hours. Frank had moonlighted at the Kim An restaurant as a security guard and knew that large amounts of cash were often kept on hand. Her colleague, Ronald Austin Williams II, was shot dead in the chaos while working at the restaurant as a security guard. 2 of the owner's family members, 17-year-old Quang Vu and his sister, 24-year-old Ha Vu, were also killed. Their sister, Chow Vu, and 2 other employees hid inside a walk-in cooler and survived. Chow later told the press that she saw Frank approaching the restaurant in uniform for the 3rd time that night and knew something was wrong, especially since she had lost her key to the front door. Frank had stolen the key during one of her earlier visits that night and used it to get inside during office hours. Unaware that there were surviving victims who had witnessed the crime, Frank fled the scene and returned a few minutes later as a responding officer, pretending she was there to help. The witnesses implicated her in the shooting, and she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She's currently the only woman on death row in Louisiana. By all appearances, Frank was an average cop who graduated near the top of her class at the police academy and was even recognized for her work in the community. But a closer look into her background revealed that she was caught lying on several parts of the job application and failed 2 standard pre-hire psychiatric evaluations. Experts advised against hiring her, but at the time, the department was desperate for new recruits to replace the officers it was losing to alleged criminal activity. Sadly, she continued the trend. Number 10. Nathaniel, Hendren, and Caitlyn Alex. Former St. Louis, Missouri police officer Nathaniel Hendren was supposed to be on duty one evening in 2019 when he decided to blow off his responsibilities and drink at his house with another fellow officer, 24-year-old Caitlyn Alex. His partner, Officer Patrick Reardon, was also there. At some point, Hendren and Alex began playing a Russian roulette-style game with a revolver that was loaded with one bullet. Reardon would later claim that his co-worker's behavior made him uncomfortable, so he left the room. As he was walking away, he heard a single gunshot. Hendren went first. The gun didn't fire, so he handed it to Alex, who pointed it at him and pulled the trigger. Once again, the gun didn't fire. Their luck ran out when Hendren took the gun back. This time it fired a bullet straight into Alex's chest. She was rushed to the hospital, where she died from her injuries. During an internal investigation, Hendren admitted that he and Alex were drinking that night, but denied using any illegal drugs. He maintained that he did not mean to shoot Alex and said that he was devastated about her death. The investigation also found that he was allegedly involved in an intense affair with his married co-worker. Hendren claimed Alex was planning to divorce her husband, who also happened to be a St. Louis cop. He ultimately pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and armed criminal action and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Hendren was denied parole in 2022, which means that he'll have to serve out the rest of his term. Reardon was not criminally charged, but is no longer a police officer. He was ordered to pay $300,000 to Alex's surviving family members to settle a wrongful death lawsuit targeting both him and Hendren. Number 9. Christopher Police. Police Sergeant Christopher Police arrived at the scene of a disturbance outside a convenience store in Sunrise, Florida in 2021. He already seemed frustrated about what he expected to encounter. He approached as the responding officers struggled to get the suspect, Jean Similian, into the back of a squad car. In a disturbing outburst that was captured on body cam footage, police threatened to remove Similian's soul from his body and pointed his pepper spray at the suspect. Hoping to de-escalate the situation, a female officer pulled the sergeant away from the car, only to have police turn his aggression toward her by grabbing her neck and pushing her backwards into another police car. He then walked back to the vehicle where the suspect was being detained, slammed the door shut, and offered some harsh words to the officer, who intervened. The footage was leaked several months later, and police was put on administrative leave while an investigation played out. After finding out he was under scrutiny by his superiors, he sent text messages to the officers under his command, urging them not to air their dirty laundry to anyone outside the platoon. He would later be accused of downplaying the incident before he knew that bodycam footage from the scene was under review. At that point, he allegedly claimed that he responded aggressively to the female officer because he didn't know who was touching him and thought they might be a threat. The department concluded that the female officer acted in accordance with its protocol, even if police didn't like her decision to step in when it seemed like he was getting out of control. In July of 2022, he was criminally charged with battery on a law enforcement officer, tampering with evidence, assault on a law enforcement officer, and assault against a suspect. He has since retired, and the criminal case appears to be ongoing. Number 8. Austin Walsh and Andrew Lawson. Andrew Lawson and Austin Walsh were best friends and roommates who shared an apartment in Palm Bay, Florida. They worked as deputies for the Brevard County Sheriff's Office. During a break from playing video games at home one Saturday night in 2022, Lawson jokingly pointed his gun at Walsh, thinking it was unloaded. But it wasn't, and he accidentally shot his closest friend in the face. According to an arrest report, Lawson pulled the trigger on his Glock 34 9mm pistol, then pulled the slide back and pulled the trigger a second time. In what can only be described as a worst nightmare come to life, he killed his best friend. Lawson immediately dialed 911 and was honest about what happened. It was clear to police and paramedics that he was genuinely distraught about Walsh's death. And while they believed it was truly a mistake, one thing Lawson should have learned in his law enforcement training is to never point a gun at someone unless you intend to shoot them. His recklessness, described by Sheriff Wayne Ivey as totally dumb and avoidable, landed him at the center of an ongoing manslaughter case. If convicted, Lawson could face up to 15 years in prison. Number 7. Deputy Wyatt Mesa. During the early morning hours one day in 2020, 23-year-old Deputy Wyatt Mesa and another officer responded to a single-vehicle car accident in rural Idaho Falls, Idaho. At the scene, they encountered the distressed driver, 35-year-old Jenna Home. As the officers attempted to take Home into custody, Sergeant Randy Flegel drove up to the scene at a high speed and struck Mesa with his patrol vehicle. Mesa died from his injuries. Authorities attempted to hold Home responsible for the officer's death, even though she didn't kill him. Prosecutors alleged that she committed several crimes that inadvertently led to the tragedy, including waving a machete at a police SUV as it approached the accident scene. Under Idaho law, they argued that it was enough to charge her in connection with Mesa's death. Unable to afford bail, Holmes spent the next 19 months languishing in county jail on pending felony involuntary manslaughter and aggravated assault charges. She pleaded not guilty to the crimes, and the defense fought to get internal investigation records released so that the conduct of the responding law enforcement officers could be taken into consideration. The Bonneville Sheriff's Office fought against having to release the documents, and the case was ultimately taken to a higher court as Home fought to clear her name. Her attorneys argued that she had a machete with her for protection and that she only waved it briefly because she felt threatened as the deputy's vehicle approached. The defense blamed Mesa's death on Sergeant Flegel's high rate of speed as he arrived at the scene and claimed that the defendant's behavior was not a factor. A judge dropped the manslaughter charge in 2021, and Home pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor in connection with the case. Mesa's family was disappointed by the outcome, and they were also upset that Flegel was not criminally charged. Number 6. Undercover operation gone wrong. In an operation known as a push-off, 2 special ops officers from Detroit's 12th precinct loitered in the street while posing as drug dealers, waiting for potential customers to approach them. Around the same time, officers from the city's 11th precinct came by to raid a suspected drug house. Not realizing the men were undercovers, the cops ordered them to the ground. Complete chaos broke out as the rest of the 12th Precinct Special Ops Squad showed up, only for members of both precincts to draw their guns and start throwing punches at each other while the homeowner looked on. At some point, someone at the scene fired a shotgun into the air. The confusion eventually settled, and the 11th Precinct proceeded to carry out the raid. Footage of the incident landed on the desk of an internal affairs investigator, and everybody involved was questioned. The incident happened back in 2017, and it's unclear whether any disciplinary action was taken. During a news conference a few days after the fiasco went down, Detroit Police Chief James Craig described the incident as probably one of the most embarrassing things he had seen throughout his time with the department. He blamed the misunderstanding on poor communication and said that someone from the 12th Precinct had failed to inform the 11th Precinct that they would be in the area. Things like this were supposed to be prevented by new policies that were implemented after the tragic deaths of officers Jack Buffer and Mark Radden in 1986. Officer Buffer and his partner were carrying out a drug raid in plain clothes when Officer Radden and his partner, who were also in plain clothes, responded to a call about a shooting at the home. The 2 teams failed to recognize each other as cops and exchanged gunfire, killing both Buffer and Radden in a tragic case of mistaken identity. Number 5. Christopher Dorner. To say that U.S. Navy veteran Christopher Dorner's law enforcement career got off on the wrong foot would be an understatement. Shortly after he joined the Los Angeles Police Department in 2006, he accused his training officer, Teresa Evans, of using excessive force on a suspect. Dorner made the complaint shortly after Evans wrote in an evaluation that his performance needed improvement. The excessive force allegation was deemed to be false, and Dorner was accused of filing the complaint in retaliation for the poor review he received from Evans. He was fired from the LAPD in 2008. Over the next 5 years, Dorner unsuccessfully appealed the decision. His anger boiled over in early 2013 when he embarked on a days-long killing spree starting with Monica Kwan, the daughter of a former LAPD captain and lawyer who represented him in his appeal. He also killed a woman's fiancé, Keith Lawrence. After the double murder, Dorner posted a disturbing 11,000-word manifesto on Facebook declaring unconventional and asymmetric warfare on the LAPD and their families, unless the agency admitted it had fired him as a punishment for complaining about Evans. He listed the names of 40 LAPD employees and others who he blamed directly for the loss of his job, and said that he would not be alive to see his name cleared. The LAPD assigned protection to the targeted officers and launched a manhunt for Dorner. He shot at officers during 2 subsequent encounters in Corona, killing Officer Michael Crane and leaving others injured. 5 days later, authorities traced Dorner to a cabin in Big Bear Lake, about 80 miles, 129 kilometers outside Los Angeles, where he barricaded himself as law enforcement approached. During a violent final standoff, he shot at San Bernardino County deputies, killing Detective Jeremiah Mackay. After failing to persuade the disgruntled ex-cop to surrender, authorities discharged pyrotechnic tear gas canisters, which caused the cabin to catch fire. The blaze was too dangerous for firefighters to enter, and Dorner never emerged from the dwelling. An autopsy of his remains ruled that he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Number 4. Houston Tipping. When 32-year-old LAPD officer Houston Tipping died during a training exercise at the department's academy in 2022, his family wanted to know exactly what happened. According to the Los Angeles coroner's office, Tipping was participating in a grappling exercise with another officer when the 2 men fell to the ground. Tipping landed on his neck and severely injured his spinal cord. To Tipping's mother, Shirley Huffman, this reasoning failed to explain some of her son's injuries. Deputy Medical Examiner Lawrence Nguyen, who performed the autopsy, said that some of Tipping's injuries came from the attempts to save his life. This included emergency surgery and the use of a device that performs mechanical chest compressions, which is known to cause rib fractures and liver injuries. In his report, Nguyen acknowledged that deaths at the hands of others are typically ruled as homicides, but that he ruled Tipping's death an accident after carefully considering the circumstances. Nguyen described tragedy as the type of thing that unfortunately sometimes happens in organized sports and exercises, and that the participants are typically aware of the risks. Unsatisfied with this explanation, Huffman lawyered up and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city. Through her lawyer, Bradley Cage, she accused the LAPD of failing to protect one of its own and claimed that her son was killed in an exercise that was intended to simulate a mob. The lawsuit alleges that Tippings was struck in the head repeatedly to the point of needing stitches, that his neck was broken several times, and that other officers had questioned the particular training exercise that killed him after becoming injured themselves. And there are no records of the mechanical chest compression device being used in the efforts to save Tipping's life. During a press conference, Gage claimed that Tippings was beaten to death and that the LAPD's version of events doesn't tell the whole story. He also revealed that at the time of his death, Tippings was investigating serious assault allegations against 4 of his colleagues. At least one of the suspects in the assault case was present when he died. Tippings had reportedly started looking for another job after initially being happy as an LAPD officer. He didn't tell his family why, but they later said that he was clearly distraught over something. While the current status of the lawsuit is unclear, the LAPD has denied the allegations and has reassured the public that it's reviewing the case to determine if any steps need to be taken to prevent a similar tragedy in the future. Number 3. Mustafa Kumor and Jonathan Shoup. Officer Mustafa Kumor was training student officer Jonathan Shoup in 2020 when a traffic stop in Bothell, Washington went terribly wrong. It all started when a pair pulled over 37-year-old Henry Eugene Washington for not having a license plate. Washington initially cooperated, but fled the scene in his car. He struck a man on a scooter, crashed into a center median, and then exited the car and began walking away from the scene. Right after Kumor and Shoop arrived at the crash, Washington turned around, approached the driver's side of the officer's SUV, and fired his handgun twice in their direction. According to a witness, he screamed, "Come on, pig," as he pulled the trigger. Kumor, who was in the passenger seat, returned fire, accidentally shooting his partner in the process. Shoop died from his injuries. Washington fled the scene and hid on a rooftop, where he called the Junction City, Kansas Police Department to pass along the message to his family that he had shot a cop. He got stuck between two buildings while coming down from the rooftop and was taken into custody. Even though Washington didn't fire the fatal bullet, prosecutors concluded that he was responsible for Shoop's death and charged him with first-degree aggravated murder, first-degree attempted murder, and vehicular assault. In charging documents, King County Senior Deputy Prosecutor Mary Barbosa wrote that if it weren't for Washington's direct attack on the officers, Shoop would still be alive. Washington allegedly admitted to the crimes during questioning. He claimed he shot at the cops because he instinctively believed they were going to kill him and said that he was worried they would take away his car, marijuana, and gun. Shoop's brother Evan agreed with the prosecution's belief that his brother would still be alive if Washington hadn't shot at the officers. He said that his brother had spoken very highly of Kumor and had a lot of respect for him, and the fallen officer's family made it clear that they did not fault Kumor for the tragedy. Number 2. Michael Rusk. In January 2023, police responded to the scene of a shooting between two off-duty officers in Williamsburg, Virginia. The victim, identified by friends and family as 38-year-old James City County Deputy Christopher Gibson, was taken to the hospital with serious but non-life-threatening bullet wounds to the stomach and arm. His friend and fellow deputy, 24-year-old Michael Rusk, was taken into custody as the suspected shooter. The two men reportedly drank together for several hours at a tavern before the incident, which happened in a parking lot outside several local businesses. Sources claimed that an argument broke out between the two and that Rusk shot at the victim 3 times. He was charged with malicious wounding, using a firearm in the commission of a felony, and discharging a firearm within city limits, and is out on bond pending the outcome of the case. When the story broke, investigators said they were working to determine the extent to which alcohol played a role in the shooting. Rusk's attorney, Thomas Cleater, said that his client was devastated by what happened. He told local station WAVY that there's a lot more to the story than the public currently knows about, and that the details will come to light very soon. Cleater also said that the evidence will speak to the other side of the story. Rusk and Gibson appeared to have had a strong friendship prior to the shooting. In a Facebook post, Gibson described Rusk as one of the finest officers I've had the honor of working with. He also helped promote a car show to raise money for Rusk when he was battling cancer in 2022. Regardless of what went wrong between the two, it's disappointing that it led to potentially life-ruining violence. Number 1. Bailey Ganon. In July of 2020, Cleveland police officer Jennison Killnap and her partner, rookie cop Bailey Ganon, responded to a call from a woman who reported that an armed man was acting strangely and fired a bullet into the floor at a local boarding house. The officers arrived to find the suspect, Darrell Borden, in the bathroom with the door closed. According to prosecutors, Borden ambushed Killnap and Ganon with gunfire when they opened the door. A bullet struck Killnap's forearm, leaving her with long-term injuries that have prevented her from returning to work, and Borden was charged with attempted murder. An investigation by state authorities later determined that Killnap was shot by a bullet from Ganon's gun when he returned fire at Borden. In fact, the entire sequence of events went differently than initial reports claimed, according to a lawsuit Killnap filed against police and city officials in 2022. She claimed that Ganon opened the bathroom door without announcing his presence, or that he was a police officer. When he saw Borden standing there with a gun, he allegedly took cover behind a wall and then ran away, firing his gun over his head in Borden's general direction before the suspect took a single shot. The lawsuit accused Ganon of failing to try de-escalating tactics before resorting to gun use, and pointed the finger at the police department for failing to train him properly. Ganon was reportedly never disciplined for the incident and continued to be highly praised in performance reviews, yet Killnap was briefly suspended for failing to turn on her body camera. The status of the case is unclear. Thanks for watching. If a co-worker's well-intending but poor response to a threatening intruder left you with career-ruining injuries but also arguably saved both your lives, would you resent them for not being more careful to avoid hurting you? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.